right. As folks are coming in, we're going to be in 2 Kings tonight. So if you want to open to 2 Kings, we're continuing our study with that. Going to be doing a little bit of review of Elijah and Elisha and that transition. And then we'll get into our study in chapter 3, starting in chapter 3. We've got a lot to go through tonight, so we're going to try to keep it to a minimum of major in-depth discussion, but if we end up getting to that, that's okay too. We're not that far behind, but we are going to try to get through 3 through 5 tonight, so that's a big goal. So just help us get there if we can. Brad, would you lead us in prayer?
Yes, sir. Oh God, our Father, thank you so much for this time to pause and meditate on your word, to think on the things that you preserved for us for thousands of years, to consider and to wrestle over. And we pray, God, that we will see what you have preserved for us. We will see the principles there. We will understand what you have intended for us. And we pray, God, that above all, that we see you, that we see your hand, we see your Son, and we see the great love and care that you have for us, and the great power in which you act, and you show us that this evening. Help guide our discussion, and may the Spirit lead us into living waters. For all this in Jesus' name.
Amen. Okay. Real quick, where are some passages that you might go to if you're looking for a king and what the expectations of a king might be? Where might that go? Where might you go for that? Expectations for a king, not necessarily, so you could go one way or the other. There are 2 passages in mind. Deuteronomy 17, okay, very good. Where was the other one? There's a first in it.
Samuel.
1 Samuel chapter 8. 1 Samuel chapter 8 and Deuteronomy 17. Those are the 2 areas that we always will go back to as a reminder as to where God's people were supposed to have their thought processes in regards to a king. One of the big important things that the king was supposed to do was what? On a daily basis, what was he to do? Jen?
Read the law.
Read the law, which he would have done what to begin with? He would have written it, right? Written it down. So it was to be there as a guide, right? What do we have today as our guide? We have the same inspired word, right? So really, even though we're not a king, the principle still is true for us today. We haven't really hit that concept, but I wanted to bring that home to us tonight. We've seen many kings so far in the divided kingdom between Israel and Judah, northern kingdom, southern kingdom. I always think of it as I comes before J, so I's up top, J's down below, right? We see that those kings, many of them, time and time again, don't heed those words, don't abide by God's commands, and in fact allow others to influence them to bring about corruption in terms of their spiritual walks. Just like us, that can happen. Doesn't have to be a king. And a lot of times, actually, the kings or those that are in charge, if they're leading the people, they lead the people in those routes. So the people that are being led have to do their own discernment, and they have to abide by God's principles, even if the ruler's not, right? Again, principles that we can apply to ourselves today. Starting at the second part of Kings, we start to see the coming back of Elijah, and we see some power presented that God provides him. What's that power, real quick? In chapter 1. Happened 2 times. It was going to happen 3 times, but it only happened 2 times. Anybody?
He called down fire to destroy
50 men, right? The king's men that came to him. But clearly this was a message to the king and to those that came to him. Didn't heed that warning the second time. Third warning, they heeded it, or at least one person out of that group, the leaders of the 50 did. So we see great power. We see God in Elijah's favor. Chapter 2, we start to see now a transition from Elijah to Elisha. And another grand event occurs, one that we kind of went into in great detail on Sunday. Somebody summarize it for us. What happened in that grand event? Don't be shy.
Elijah was taken up in a chariot of fire.
A whirlwind, right? What was the words that Elisha and Elijah had right before this event? Go ahead, Jen.
That Elisha wanted a double portion of Elijah's spirit.
Okay. But that wasn't it was contingent upon something. What was it contingent upon? The eyewitness, right? All the way. Okay? Tonight, we're going to see if that comes into fruition. Okay? What were some of the things that Elijah was able to accomplish here on this earth? And now what is Elijah before Elisha now? Where is he going to be? So, we're in chapter 3. And with chapter 3, if I get back to my notes that actually started, we start to see a development that we've seen in the past. And it's a development that is kind of odd because of the personalities involved. But as you can even see on the screen, there's a division that is there. There's the green that represents Israel, and you have Judah represented by that orange color, or kind of yellowish orange color. It's a vivid orange on my screen, not so much on your screen. There's a division, but yet there's peace at the moment. And so these partners, these kings, are basically saying to each other, hey, will you help me? Right? One's asking the other one, will you help me? And the other one says, sure, right? Sure. Of course you will, right? Because we're kin, right? So blood runs thick. Sometimes to our detriment, but in this instance, they had resolved to do a task together. What was the task that was asked at this time? 2 kings, what are their names first? What are the names? Who is it, the northern? Okay. Who is at the southern then? Jehoram. Okay. Okay. So Jehoram, give me a little bit of indication of who he was. What's his lineage? Who did he come from?
Ahab.
he's a swell guy, wasn't he? He was one of the best. And wrong answer. Absolutely one of the worst that they had seen as a king. And so you see a following on in tradition, but there was at least a glimpse of hope. What was his redeeming value, I guess you would say, or thing that he was able to do?
It wasn't quite as bad as his father and mother.
Yeah.
Because he got rid of the sacred stone of Baal that his father had made.
Wait, there's a mom involved? That's just as bad as dad?
Worse.
Yeah. Pretty bad combo there. And so at least there's a glimmer of hope with him. He teams up with a good guy, Jehoshaphat, who we know from our past readings actually did a similar thing. And it was with this dad of the other side, right? The northern folks of God's people. So we see that there is redeeming value that could be had here. I want you to consider something. Somebody turn to 2 Corinthians chapter 6. 2 Corinthians chapter 6. Keep your hands there in 2 Kings 3. Somebody go to 2 Corinthians chapter 6 and read verse 14 for me.
Do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers. For what partnership has righteousness with lawlessness? Or what fellowship has light with darkness?
Pretty good summary of what we're looking at here. You've got companions that aren't exactly equally yoked, right? You have one that is definitely much more on the light, one that's definitely much more on the dark. Do you think that the light is going to influence the dark, or the dark going to influence the light? Let's find out. All right. As we go on, they decide that they're going to go up against who in verse 4 and 5? There's this other king that they want to go up against. Noted here in this kind of grayish area. I don't know if, can you guys see that?
Yeah.
I know you can, but can somebody in the back see it?
I mean, it's a little bit small.
We'll see if we can have Don's expertise get us there. Or maybe it just won't go any farther. And that's okay too. So, going up against who? King of Moab, okay? That gives you a general idea of where it is. So Israel, Judah, Moab. They decide to go through what land? What area?
Edom.
Either Ammon or Edom. Brad says Edom. Okay. They wander through there. How many days? How many days? It's a significant number. We see it often. 7 days. They're wandering. And then what happens?
No water.
No water. No water. So what are we going to do now? We're going to panic and blame. Right? That's the good way of doing it. Panic and blame. But is that the correct course that they should have taken? We see two different kind of divulging thought processes here. One of these kings has that feeling. The other one says, is there a prophet in the town, in the area that we can go to? What do you see in this scenario? Do you see those inherent patterns of somebody who is in the light versus somebody who is in the dark? Somebody who has a thought pattern that is always going down that negative train, and a thought pattern that's always going down a more positive train, right? That's what I see here. The same scenario, two different people, two different opposing viewpoints in how they assess the situation. Two different expectations, Mike says. Do we ever have that happen to us, even in our household? That can happen so often, even if we're both members of God's body, because of the way that we were brought up. Or it could be just what's inherent in us. So just keep that in mind as we're going through this. Any other thoughts or comments or questions up to this point? So we're basically up to about verse 11, verse 12 of chapter 3. Sorry, wrong chapter. How about 3? All right. Somebody give me a scenario, or the instances that come up next. What's our next? Elisha says what?
Elisha really doesn't like Joram, but he respects Jehoshaphat, so he solves the water problem. He says, play a harp.
Yep.
And then while the harp is playing, he prophesies. He says, tomorrow, this valley is going to be full of water.
Full of water, right?
And then meanwhile, the Moabites are over there on the hillside, like, when are we going to attack?
Yeah.
They're kind of trying to strategize on that,
And they get to a pool of water, don't they? An area of water.
yeah, well, it sounds like to me like they're looking over, and as the sun comes up,
Right.
it's shining off
Right.
the water, and it looks like blood from a distance. And they're
Yeah.
like, oh man, they must have slaughtered each other so much.
Yeah.
Israel and Judah and maybe the Edomites.
And Edom too, right? They're just going at each other. So that must have been the scenario. That's what going through their heads, right? That's what. So it is quite interesting how all this comes about, because Elisha, when he's first presented to these two kinsmen that are kings, he's not exactly happy to be there, right? Per what Brad had just mentioned, because he's like, I don't know about this guy over here, but over here, how about just the opposite? This guy over here, yeah, I'm with. This guy over here, not so much, right? I'm only doing this as, it's almost like a favor is the way that it kind of comes across, because Jehoshaphat is here. If Jehoshaphat wasn't here, no deal, right? But he helps them out. He says this is what's going to happen. Not only is there going to be plenty of water, but what else is going to happen? What was the other thing that he mentioned? Elisha says, you're going to be able to take Moab, okay? And not just take, but basically annihilate. And so, again, who is God in the presence of at this point? Which side? Would you say more on Jehoram's side or more on Jehoshaphat's side / Elisha's side? I would say he's in this camp over here, much more at this point. So now we have to talk to ourselves in the back of our minds, why is this? Why is this occurring? Why is it that he's allowing this to happen? Okay? We may not know the answer to that, but I want you to have that in the back of your mind as you're going through this. All right, so let's go down to 21, when the Moabites heard that the kings had come up to fight against them, all who were able to put on armor, from the youngest to the oldest, were called out and were drawn up at the border. So, this is where we see them kind of glimpsing in to see that red blood. But notice that this is a large swath of people that they have available to go to battle. And now go down to when they came to the camp, verse 24. When they came to the camp of Israel, the Israelites rose and struck the Moabites till they fled before them. And they went forward, striking the Moabites as they went, and they overthrew the cities. And on every good piece of land, every man threw a stone until it was covered. They stopped every spring of water. They felled all the good trees till only its stones were left in Kir Haresh. And the slingers surrounded and attacked it. Annihilation. What Elijah had prophesied was going to happened exactly the way that he had foretold. So, we've seen how some of the prophets previously were not on par with what God had for them to actually proclaim. Here, we see the same type of image with Elisha that we did with Elijah. And so you see those, it's that remnant that is being brought along in this sea of evil, really. Any other thoughts or comments on chapter 3? What happens at the very end of chapter 3? What despicable thing happens at the end of chapter 3?
King of Moab sacrificed his son.
Why in the world? Why in the world?
Trying to appease
Yeah.
a god.
Yeah.
Not just any son, it's his firstborn, who is heir to the throne.
It's hard for us to imagine an environment that supported those types of things, right? Because we're so removed from that environment. But that's what they knew. Brad.
I feel like if you've seen the Lord of the Rings trilogy, like the Steward of Gondor, I think that's right. He's losing the battle. His son is dying, is wounded, and he carries him in to burn him, and they're just gonna be burned alive, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like maybe that might be closer to the despair, like
Right. Yep.
he just like they came through and did Austin's worst nightmare. They threw a stone on until everybody brought a rock so that they couldn't plow. Like they were gonna have to spend hours and hours getting all the rocks off the fields now.
Yeah.
And then one last effort, he took with him 700 swordsmen to break through the king of Edom, but they failed. 700 swordsmen just trying to break the line, failed. And
One
now,
last attempt, right?
last desperate move, he's going to just, probably out of sheer anger and rage, he sacrifices his own son.
Well,
and I wasn't real sure how your translation reads, but the NIV says the fury against Israel after the sacrifice, the fury against Israel was great.
Yeah.
They withdrew and returned to their own land.
Yeah.
So I'm not real sure who's they, who withdrew and returned to their own land.
I took that as obviously Israel, in mine it says, and this is English Standard, there came great wrath against Israel, and they withdrew from him and returned to their own land. So they withdrew from him. So I'm guessing it was
So Israel.
their own king. I was taking it,
Okay.
but
Who do you think? Israel?
That's the way it reads.
It sounds like the child sacrifice worked
yeah,
because there was such fury against Israel that Israel goes back to their own land.
yeah, it could be.
So I don't know if that's the right way to read that, but yeah, it just seems a really, really interesting end to that story.
Yeah.
Like just
Doesn't it though?
total desperation and godlessness.
John.
Yeah, I struggle with the twist on that last verse. Some other versions talk about being a great anger on Israel.
Mm-hmm.
So culturally, I think Deuteronomy 12:31 maybe. The idea of child sacrifice was abominable to God.
It is, yeah.
So for Israel to see that, almost like it was maybe more like psychological warfare. They've seen this, he's waving it in front of them. It's like, oh my, what did you just do? And so some versions talk about being anger came upon Israel and left, basically. So I don't know, when I got looking at it and some references, nobody really agrees, but that was the interpretation that made more sense to me. Because
Yeah.
otherwise it does kind of lean to, he made a sacrifice to his God, and he overpowered Israel. But I don't think that's the case. I think I lean more towards the latter one.
Yeah. I was a little uncertain, so I wasn't necessarily going to go there. But that's okay. I don't have any problems of doing it. It was just like, which group is actually fleeing at this point in time, right? Maybe. It's hard to tell. But clearly, this sacrifice had an impact. One way or the other, there was an impact. What I thought was interesting, and I wondered if maybe this was his last thought, like, okay, well, we're going to be overtaken, so I'm just going to sacrifice, and maybe that's one last ditch effort. So the swordsmen were my last ditch effort, now this is kind of my last ditch effort, right, to save us. I don't know.
I think the other thing that like pops into my mind, and I don't think this is the case, but just we talk about specifically with Israel, but also Judah, right? And they did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, etc., 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 king after king.
Yep.
And then at the beginning of chapter 3, it talks about the king of Moab. Once Ahab dies, he says, "This is an opportunity for me to get away." And so part of me like thinking through this thinks at the very end that Israel is somehow culpable for the fact that the conflict started to begin with. And then it leads to child sacrifice, and then, like John was saying, it's wrath upon Israel, like,
Yeah.
you kept leading down this path, and now it's further dividing your state, and
Yeah. Yeah. Very well could be. Micah.
One other thought, please don't take this the wrong way, it could sound really blasphemous, but, God sent his son as a sacrifice.
Mm-hmm.
And he asked Abraham to sacrifice his son, Isaac, and Abraham was ready to do that. We know that he stopped him.
Mhm.
We know that child sacrifice was an abomination, but I think what they've done is a perversion of something that is necessary. I mean, sacrifice is necessary.
Right.
And so
Right.
I think there is that knowledge that there has to be a blood sacrifice, and then they've perverted it in this way,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not completely out of left field. It's just a perversion.
That's a good point. No, that's a good point. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And you wonder, to that thought process, was that part of why these other nations did that for these other gods? You know? Possibly, right? Possibly.
There is one more thing I would say. You gotta remember, this is an army that doesn't have faith in God necessarily. So
Mhm.
they're seeing something they recognize as a pagan sacrifice. Maybe they were fear of this curse too.
right, let's get on to chapter 4. We've got a series of events that we see glimpses of Elisha's abilities that are given to him, that we kind of start to see some similarities between Elijah and Elisha. This first particular scenario involved a widow. And if you recall, back in 1 Kings chapter 17, who did Elijah go to? He went to a widow, right? Widow at Zarephath is where that particular widow lived and that he came upon. In that scenario, God asked him to go to that widow. And in that scenario, there was a lack of food in the house, a lack of oil, a lack of flour. And so he asked for bread. And she's like, well, this is the last. I was going to make the very, very, very last that I have. And he says, well, make some for me first, and then you. Okay? And what happened with that scenario? There was abundance of oil and flour that they would be able to eat multiple days afterwards with. Overflowing, if you will. What's the scenario with this instance? A woman is from a different land, right?
And her husband died, and now they have all this debt, and that they can't pay off.
Yeah.
So the creditor is going to come and take her 2 sons and sell them as slaves to recoup the debt.
Yeah.
And so that's what she's faced with.
Poverty and slavery. And we see here that Elisha, she comes to him, doesn't she, in this scenario? So it's the opposite of Elijah and the widow at Zarephath. So in this scenario, he says in verse 2, or verse 3, go outside, borrow vessels from all your neighbors, empty vessels, and not too few. So get lots of them, in other words, right? Shut the door behind yourself and your sons and pour into all these vessels, and when one is full, set it aside. And then what happens? When she pours out, there in verse 5, they brought the vessels to her. The vessels were full. She said to her son, bring me another vessel. And he said to her, there is not another. Then the oil stopped flowing. Okay? She came and told the man of God, who was who? Elisha. And he said, go, sell the oil, and pay your debts, and you and your sons can live on the rest. Again, there was nothing, and all of a sudden, there's overflowing. What's the lessons that we see between these two stories here? What are the lessons? Do you see that these people are in lands that are filled with evil, but yet they have some faith? Do you also see that if they are with God and they believe in Elisha and Elijah, that good things are going to come to them, right? For us, do you see the glass half empty or half full in scenarios that come your way? So for me personally, it's been a rocky road for the last month and a half with all this uncertainty with what my work is going to be, if I'm going to have a job. And there were times that my glass was definitely half empty. Definitely. But it didn't take me long to have it as half full. It went from 1 to 2 days. What are we going to do? Just trying to get your mind around everything. And then it's like, no, God's here with us. No matter what happens, He's going to see us through, no matter what. You know, I take these types of scenarios to heart. And I think that there's a reason why we're studying these for me personally. It's been amazing how much I've gleaned out of these studies, and yet it has nothing to do with me, right? Nothing to do with me. But it does. All right, scenario number 2. Starting in verse, Verse 8. What happens here? There's another land, Shunem, or another city, Shunem. There's a Shunammite woman that's there. Somebody give me the scenario with this particular incident. She's not alone in this instance either. She's got her husband with her, although he's older, isn't he? He's a little bit older.
They have no son.
No son. Okay, yep.
And Elisha would kind of travel through there a lot.
Yeah.
So they're like, hey, let's just make him a little spot where he can stay up on the roof of our house.
Well, first, she had said every time, come in, eat with us, stay with us, right? She went overboard in hospitality, right? And then she takes it to the next level and says, hey, hubby, I've got a to-do list for you, right? We ever get those? Yeah, we do. This one, though, I'm sure that he's a man of God. I know it. So she says, let's do this. Let's build a room for him when he comes. So when he comes this one time, what happens? What's the scenario? One day he came there in verse 11, and he turned into the chamber and rested there, right? Call the Shunammite woman. What can I do for you? Is there anything that you would like? And we've seen this requesting, asking, is there something you need, something you want? And she basically says, no. I don't have a son. My husband's old. We don't need anything. He's trying to repay that hospitality, isn't he? What happens then after this?
He says, in a year, you're going to have a son. And she says, don't mess with me. I can't handle that.
Okay. Well, I guess we get to shelter somewhere. Restrooms would be the best. That's an alarm, so we need to shelter in place, guys. I would say the most inner rooms would be better than staying out there. That would be my suggestion. As we were just talking about the fact that we shouldn't have much to worry about, let's go this way, guys. This way, guys. This way. Just get in, hunker down in a room. Probably that room would be better. That room would be better. Let's not do this one.